They say you can tell a man's story by the way he holds a gun, and the old cowboy standing in the dust of Redstone Hollow held as like a memory he wasn't sure he needed anymore. The afternoon sun hung low over the street, painting the wooden buildings in a dull amber glow while the wind pushed thin ribbons of dust across the road. Horses shifted near the hitching posts, leather creaking softly, and the smell of warm hay and spilled whiskey drifted out of the saloon doors. Most days in Redstone Hollow moved slow, the kind of slow that let a man hear the ticking of the clock inside the general store from halfway down the street. But that afternoon was different. A small crowd had gathered without meaning to, drawn by the laughter of a few young men who stood in a loose circle in the center of the road. They were the kind of riders that appeared in towns like this every season or so: loud boots, bright scarves, confidence that came easy when you traveled in a group. Their leader was a tall fellow named Wade Mercer, not more than 25, with a polished revolver on his hip and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Wade held that smile now as he looked at the man in front of him, a gray-haired cowboy whose coat had seen more winters than most people in the town could remember. The old man's horse stood a few yards away near the watering trough, ribs showing slightly beneath a faded saddle blanket. The animal flicked its tail lazily, unaware that its rider had become the center of attention for half the town. The old cowboy himself didn't look like much. His hat brim had softened with years of sun and rain, and the dust on his boots had settled so deep it seemed part of the leather. But when he raised his eyes, they were steady, clear, and quiet in a way that made a few of the older men watching from the porch shift their weight uneasily. Wade Mercer spun his revolver once on his finger before pressing the grip into the old cowboy's hand. "Tell you what," Wade said with a laugh that echoed across the street. "You hit one bottle, and you walk away." Behind him, one of the other riders lined 6 empty whiskey bottles along a rail fence about 30 feet away, their glass necks glinting under the sun. Someone near the saloon doorway chuckled, and another voice muttered that this ought to be good. The old cowboy looked down at the revolver resting in his palm, as if he hadn't held one in years. For a moment, the only sound was the wind brushing through the dry grass outside town and the quiet creak of saddle leather from a nearby hitching post. Then the old man exhaled slowly and lifted the gun. The first shot cracked through the afternoon air and kicked up a puff of dust several feet beside the bottles. Laughter burst out from the group of riders, loud and easy, the kind of laughter that spreads quickly when men believe they've already won. Wade Mercer tipped his hat back, grinning wide as he glanced toward the watching crowd. But the old cowboy only nodded once to himself, shifted the revolver into his other hand, and lifted it again with a calm that didn't quite match the moment. The revolver rested in the old cowboy's other hand now, and something about the way he held it made the laughter around him slow just a little. Not stop, not yet, but soften. The wind moved through Redstone Hollow again, carrying the dry scent of sun-baked wood and dust along the empty street. Wade Mercer folded his arms with an amused grin, rocking back slightly on his heels as if the whole thing were nothing more than afternoon entertainment. Behind him, the 6 bottles still stood on the fence rail, thin necks catching the sunlight like small mirrors. 30 feet was not far for a practice shooter, but to the watching crowd the distance suddenly felt longer. The old cowboy raised the revolver again, this time with his left hand steady and relaxed at his side. There was no rush in his movement, no dramatic gesture, just a quiet motion that seemed almost ordinary. One of the men leaning against the saloon doorway shifted his stance and narrowed his eyes, studying the stranger more carefully now. The sheriff, Daniel Burke, had stepped out onto the wooden boardwalk sometime during the laughter. At first he had simply crossed his arms and watched the spectacle like everyone else. But when the revolver changed hands, his expression tightened slightly. The sheriff took a slow step forward, boots creaking against the boards, his eyes locked on the gray-haired cowboy standing in the street. Something about that posture stirred an old memory he could not quite place. The old cowboy drew a slow breath and looked down the line of bottles as if he were measuring the afternoon light itself. His hat cast a narrow shadow across his face, hiding most of his expression, but the calm in his shoulders was unmistakable. The revolver lifted. The street grew quiet without anyone asking for silence. Even Wade Mercer felt the change in the air, though he tried not to show it. He tilted his head and laughed again, louder than before, as if the sound alone could keep the moment from shifting. "Go ahead," Wade said. "Let us see what the other hand can do." The old cowboy did not answer. His finger moved gently against the trigger. The sound of the shot snapped through the street like a dry branch breaking in the wind. One bottle burst into glittering fragments. Before the echo faded, another shot followed. Then another. Then another. 6 sharp cracks rolled across Redstone Hollow faster than most people could count. For a heartbeat, the town did not react. The pieces of glass fell slowly into the dust, catching the sunlight as they dropped. The fence rail stood empty now, every bottle gone. The revolver lowered again as calmly as it had been raised. The old cowboy glanced once at the shattered glass scattered across the ground, then brushed a speck of dust from his sleeve as though the moment had been nothing at all. Wade Mercer's grin had faded somewhere between the third shot and the fourth. The laughter behind him had vanished completely. The sheriff stepped down from the boardwalk and into the street, his eyes wide now, staring at the man with the gray hat. He had finally remembered where he had seen that stance before. The sheriff stopped in the middle of the dusty street as the last shards of glass settled into the dirt, and for a moment no one in Redstone Hollow moved or spoke. The wind slipped quietly between the buildings again, pushing a loose newspaper across the road and rattling the faded sign above the saloon door. Wade Mercer stared at the empty fence rail as if the bottles might somehow return if he looked long enough. 6 bottles had stood there only seconds ago. 6 bottles that were now nothing but glittering dust at the cowboy's feet. The old man rested the revolver loosely in his hand, the same calm expression still hidden beneath the shadow of his hat. He did not look proud. He did not look angry. If anything, he looked slightly tired, as if the whole thing had required more effort than he had planned. Sheriff Daniel Burke took another step closer, the wooden badge on his chest catching the late afternoon sun. His eyes stayed fixed on the cowboy's face, studying the lines around his eyes, the set of his shoulders, the quiet way he held himself. Pieces of an old memory were beginning to fit together in his mind, fragments of stories he had heard years earlier when he was still a young deputy riding the border towns along the Colorado Territory. Stories about a man who never raised his voice, a man who rarely stayed in one place longer than a week, a man whose name had once traveled across saloons and railroad camps like a whisper carried by the wind. Burke stopped about 10 feet away and cleared his throat slowly. The sound seemed louder than it should have in the sudden silence. Wade Mercer noticed the sheriff's expression and shifted uneasily, though he tried to keep the same confident grin on his face. "Well," Wade said, forcing a small laugh, "looks like the old-timer still has a little luck left in him." None of the other riders laughed this time. They stood behind Wade with their hats pulled low, watching the quiet stranger more carefully than before. One of them glanced down at the broken glass near his boots, and then back up again as if trying to understand what had just happened. The old cowboy finally slipped the revolver gently back into Wade Mercer's hand without a word. The motion was slow and respectful, like a man returning something that never belonged to him. Wade accepted the gun automatically, though his fingers tightened around the grip in a way that suggested the moment no longer felt like a joke. Sheriff Burke drew in a long breath through his nose. The name had surfaced now, rising out of the years like a shape appearing through fog. He had seen a photograph once in an old Ranger report, a younger version of the same face standing beside a rail station somewhere near the mountains. The sheriff looked at the gray-haired cowboy again, his voice quieter now than anyone had ever heard it. "You would not happen to be Samuel Callahan, would you?" The old cowboy lifted his eyes toward the sheriff at last, and for the first time the faintest trace of a smile touched the corner of his mouth as the people of Redstone Hollow slowly began to realize that the quiet stranger standing in their street was not just another passing traveler. For a few seconds after the sheriff spoke the name, the street of Redstone Hollow seemed to forget how to breathe. The wind slowed, the loose newspaper stopped sliding across the dirt, and even the horses tied along the hitching rail stood unusually still, as if they could sense the weight of the moment. Samuel Callahan did not answer right away. He simply looked at Sheriff Daniel Burke with the quiet patience of a man who had been asked that question many times before. The faint smile on his face never quite grew, but it did not disappear either. Wade Mercer shifted his boots in the dust, glancing from the sheriff to the gray-haired cowboy and back again. "Sam Callahan?" Wade repeated with a short laugh that sounded more uncertain than confident. You mean that old trail story? The one about the fastest draw west of the Colorado. None of the riders behind him joined the laugh. They had all heard stories growing up along the cattle routes and railroad towns. Stories about a quiet rider who traveled alone and left behind little more than empty bottles on fence rails and stunned crowds outside saloons. The kind of stories young men told around campfires late at night when the wind was strong and the stars felt close enough to touch. Sheriff Burke nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the old cowboy. That is the one, he said. I saw the ranger reports myself 15 years ago when I was riding down near Silver Ridge. He paused, letting the memory settle in his mind like dust after a passing wagon. They said he could draw before most men even realized the contest had started. The riders standing behind Wade Mercer exchanged uneasy looks now. One of them quietly adjusted his hat and stepped half a foot backward without thinking about it. The confidence that had filled the street only minutes earlier had thinned into something far more cautious. Samuel Callahan finally tipped the brim of his worn hat back just enough for the sunlight to touch his eyes. They were not the sharp steel-gray eyes of a young gunfighter anymore. Years had softened them, and the long roads of the West had left faint lines around their corners. But there was still a steadiness there that made every man watching feel as though he were standing under a clear sky with nowhere to hide. "Sheriff," Sam said calmly, his voice low and even. That was a long time ago. The words carried no pride and no regret. They sounded like a simple fact spoken by someone who had already moved on from the story everyone else still remembered. Wade Mercer looked down at the revolver in his hand, and then back toward the shattered glass scattered along the ground. His grin had disappeared completely now, replaced by the uneasy awareness that the afternoon had taken a turn he had not expected. "Well," Wade muttered, clearing his throat as he slid the revolver back into its holster. "Guess a man learns a few tricks over the years." Samuel Callahan gave a small nod as if that explanation was good enough for him. He turned slightly toward the watering trough where his old horse waited patiently, flicking its tail against the warm air. The town watched in silence as the quiet rider began to walk back toward his saddle, and more than one person in Redstone Hollow realized that they had just witnessed the kind of moment people would still be talking about 20 years from now. Samuel Callahan moved slowly toward the watering trough where his old horse waited, the worn boards creaking softly beneath his boots as the afternoon sun leaned lower over Redstone Hollow. The horse lifted its head when he approached, ears turning forward with the quiet recognition of an animal that had traveled many miles beside the same rider. Sam rested a hand along the horse's neck, brushing a thin layer of trail dust from the faded saddle blanket while the town continued to watch from behind him. No one laughed now. No one spoke loudly. The moment had shifted into something quieter and heavier, the kind of silence that settles over a place when people realize they have just crossed paths with a piece of living history. Sheriff Daniel Burke remained standing in the street, one hand resting loosely on his belt as he studied the older cowboy with a thoughtful expression. The sheriff had seen many riders pass through Redstone Hollow over the years, cattle drivers, gamblers, railroad men, and wandering drifters chasing the promise of the next town. But Samuel Callahan was different. Even standing beside a tired horse with a worn coat and dusty boots, there was something steady about him that felt older than the town itself. Wade Mercer cleared his throat again behind the sheriff, still trying to decide how to stand now that the easy laughter of a few minutes earlier had disappeared. He took a slow step closer, boots pressing into the soft dirt where the broken glass had already begun to lose its shine. "You really are that man," Wade said, his voice quieter now, almost curious. Sam adjusted the strap of his saddlebag and gave a small nod without looking back. "That is what people used to say," he answered calmly. The words drifted across the street with the same gentle weight as the warm breeze moving through the town. Wade studied the older cowboy for a moment longer, then glanced toward the shattered bottles near the fence rail. 6 clean shots, faster than he had ever seen before. The confidence that had carried him through so many small-town showdowns suddenly felt smaller in comparison. Sheriff Burke stepped a little closer to Sam's horse and lowered his voice. "Folks said you disappeared after the rail lines pushed west," the sheriff said. "Most people figured you had either settled down somewhere quiet or ridden so far out that nobody would see you again." Sam ran his hand along the horse's mane once more, thinking for a moment before answering. A man does not disappear, he said slowly. He just keeps riding until the road becomes quieter. The sheriff nodded as if that answer made perfect sense. Around them, the people of Redstone Hollow began to relax slightly, though their eyes still followed every movement the old cowboy made. Some leaned against the wooden posts of the storefronts while others stood beside their wagons, quietly aware that the afternoon had turned into a story they would repeat for years. Wade Mercer shifted his weight again and looked down the long, dusty road that stretched beyond the edge of town. The same road Samuel Callahan had likely traveled for thousands of miles across the Western Territories. So where does a legend ride after a town like this? Wade asked carefully. Sam placed one boot into the stirrup and prepared to mount his horse, the leather creaking softly as he lifted himself into the saddle. He looked once toward the distant hills glowing in the fading sunlight, then back toward the quiet street behind him. Wherever the road is still honest, he said simply. And for a moment the people of Redstone Hollow wondered if the old cowboy's journey through their town had not ended quite yet. Samuel Callahan settled into the saddle with the slow ease of a man who had spent half his life on horseback, the leather giving a quiet groan beneath his weight as the horse shifted patiently under him. The late afternoon light stretched long shadows across Redstone Hollow, turning the dusty street into a ribbon of amber and gold. For a moment it seemed as though he truly intended to ride out without another word, just another quiet traveler passing through a small town on the edge of the frontier. But something in the stillness of the street held him there a second longer. Sheriff Daniel Burke watched from a few yards away, arms resting loosely at his sides, his eyes following the old cowboy with the careful respect that only comes from recognizing a man's past. The sheriff had learned long ago that the West carried its history in living people more often than in books. And Samuel Callahan was clearly one of those histories. Wade Mercer stood behind the sheriff now, his earlier swagger replaced by a thoughtful silence. He glanced once more toward the broken glass near the fence rail, then toward the revolver resting at his hip, as if measuring the difference between reputation and experience. The other riders behind him had grown unusually quiet, their attention drifting between Sam and the long road leading out of town. The wind brushed softly across the street again, carrying the dry scent of sage and dust from the open prairie beyond the buildings. Sam rested one hand lightly on the saddle horn and looked down the road where the sun was slowly lowering behind the distant hills. For a moment his expression softened with the distant look of a man remembering miles already traveled. Then he turned his head slightly toward the sheriff. "You keep a calm town here," Sam said in that same steady voice that seemed to belong more to the open plains than to crowded streets. Sheriff Burke allowed a small smile to appear beneath his mustache. "Most days," he replied, "though sometimes a little noise helps people remember their manners." Wade Mercer shifted again and stepped forward a half pace, his boots pressing softly into the dirt. He tipped his hat with a careful respect that had not been there earlier that afternoon. "Mr. Callahan," Wade said slowly, choosing his words with more care than before, "I reckon I owe you an apology for the way we started things today." The town seemed to lean closer to the moment. Sam studied the young man for a few seconds, his eyes calm but thoughtful. Then he gave a small nod that carried no judgment, only the quiet understanding of someone who had once been young himself. "A man learns," Sam said simply. Wade nodded once, accepting the answer like a lesson he would remember long after the dust settled. Sheriff Burke glanced toward the distant horizon where the road curved gently through the prairie grass. "You planning to stay the night?" the sheriff asked, "or keep riding before dark?" Samuel Callahan looked at the sky where the sun was dipping lower, the clouds glowing faintly orange above the hills. His horse shifted beneath him again, as if already aware that another stretch of road might be waiting. Sam rested his hand along the horse's neck and gave a thoughtful breath. "That depends," he said quietly, "on whether this town still has something worth seeing after sunset." The words hung lightly in the warm evening air, and for the first time since the shattered bottles had fallen, Redstone Hollow felt like a place where the story might not be finished just yet. The warm light of evening settled deeper over Redstone Hollow, stretching long golden shadows across the wooden storefronts and the quiet street where the town had gathered. Samuel Callahan remained in the saddle, his horse standing calm beneath him, breathing slow and steady as if it had learned long ago that its rider never rushed the road ahead. Sheriff Daniel Burke rested his hands on his belt and studied the older cowboy with a thoughtful look, the kind a man carries when he senses that something important has just entered his town. Around them, the people of Redstone Hollow had begun drifting a little closer again, curiosity slowly replacing the tension that had filled the air earlier that afternoon. Wade Mercer stood a few feet away now, his hat tilted lower than before and his voice carrying a new tone of respect when he spoke. "Well," Wade said carefully, glancing toward the saloon where lanterns were beginning to glow in the windows. "If you are looking for something worth seeing after sunset, the only place in this town that comes close is inside that building right there." He nodded toward the swinging doors of the Redstone Saloon where the smell of coffee, tobacco, and fresh bread drifted gently into the street. Sam followed Wade's glance and watched the lantern light flicker softly against the dusty windows. The quiet sound of a piano key being tested inside floated briefly into the evening air before fading again. It had been a long time since he had stopped anywhere long enough to listen to music. Sheriff Burke gave a small nod toward the saloon as well. "Miss Clara runs the place these days," the sheriff said. "She makes the best stew in 3 counties and keeps the peace better than most lawmen I have known." A faint smile crossed Sam's face at that. "Sounds like a town with good sense," he replied calmly. Wade shifted his boots in the dirt and looked up at the older rider with something close to admiration now. "You should come inside," Wade said. "Folks would not mind hearing a story or two from a man who has ridden as far as you have." Samuel Callahan considered the invitation quietly, his eyes moving once more across the town. He noticed the old general store with its faded paint, the wagon parked beside the blacksmith shop, and the narrow boardwalk where a few children now peeked from behind their parents with wide, curious eyes. It reminded him of many towns he had passed through during the long years when the frontier still stretched open and uncertain. For a moment, he wondered how many of those towns still existed. The horse beneath him shifted again, nudging its nose lightly against Sam's boot as if reminding him that evening had arrived. Sam reached down and patted the animal's neck before glancing back toward the glowing saloon windows. The faint sound of laughter drifted out into the cooling air now, warm and welcoming. Sheriff Burke watched him carefully. "You look like a man who has spent a long time riding alone," the sheriff said gently. Sam gave a quiet breath that almost sounded like a chuckle. "Long enough to forget what a friendly town feels like," he admitted. Wade Mercer stepped aside, gesturing politely toward the boardwalk that led to the saloon doors. The town of Redstone Hollow waited in quiet anticipation as the legendary rider finally nudged his horse forward toward the lantern light. And somewhere deep in the warm evening air it began to feel as though the night ahead might hold more than just another story about the past. Samuel Callahan guided his horse slowly toward the lantern light of the Redstone Saloon, the wooden boards of the hitching rail creaking softly as he tied the reins with practiced hands. The evening air had cooled just enough to carry the warm smells drifting from inside the building, fresh bread, strong coffee, and the faint trace of tobacco smoke that clung to every frontier saloon west of the Mississippi River. The soft glow from the lanterns spilled across the boardwalk and into the street, painting the dust in shades of gold and amber. For a moment Sam stood beside his horse with one hand resting lightly on the saddle horn, listening to the quiet rhythm of the town settling into evening. The piano inside struck a slow chord, followed by another, as if someone was testing the keys before the night truly began. Wade Mercer stepped up onto the boardwalk ahead of him and pushed the swinging doors open just enough for the music and conversation inside to spill out into the street. The sound was warm and inviting, a mixture of low laughter, clinking glasses, and the steady voice of a woman speaking somewhere behind the bar. Sheriff Daniel Burke followed a few steps behind Sam, his boots tapping softly against the boards as he leaned one shoulder against a wooden post. "That sound right there," the sheriff said quietly, nodding toward the piano, "is usually how a good evening starts in this town." Sam listened for another moment, his eyes moving across the lanterns swaying gently in the breeze. It had been many miles since he had heard a piano played in a room full of friendly voices. Most nights on the trail were filled with little more than the wind over the prairie and the steady breathing of his horse beside the fire. Wade Mercer held the door open wider now and glanced back toward the older rider. Miss Clara will want to meet you, Wade said. She has a habit of knowing every traveler that comes through her saloon. Sam tipped the brim of his hat slightly and stepped onto the boardwalk, the wooden planks giving a quiet creak under his boots. As he pushed through the doors, the warmth of the room wrapped around him immediately. The Redstone Saloon was not large, but it carried the comfortable feeling of a place that had welcomed travelers for many years. Lanterns hung from thick wooden beams above the bar, their light reflecting gently off polished glasses lined neatly along the shelves. A small upright piano stood near the corner where a young man sat playing a slow Western tune that drifted easily through the room. Conversations softened as people noticed the newcomer stepping inside. Samuel Callahan removed his hat politely and glanced around the room, offering a small nod to the faces watching him with growing curiosity. Behind the bar stood a woman with silver hair pinned neatly beneath a blue ribbon, her calm eyes studying the quiet rider with the kind of thoughtful interest that only comes from running a saloon long enough to read the stories carried by strangers. She wiped her hands on a white cloth and leaned slightly forward across the bar. "Evening," she said warmly. "You look like a man who has ridden a long road to get here." Sam rested his hat gently on the bar and returned the faintest smile. "Ma'am," he replied calmly. "The road has a way of getting longer every year." Around the room the quiet conversations began to rise again, but now every person in the Redstone Saloon knew they were sharing the same evening with a traveler whose name had once ridden the wind across the western frontier. The lantern light inside the Redstone Saloon glowed warmer as the evening deepened outside, and the quiet piano melody drifted gently through the room like a slow river moving through the hills. Samuel Callahan rested both hands on the polished edge of the bar, while the woman behind it studied him with calm interest. Miss Clara had run the saloon long enough to recognize the difference between a man simply passing through and a man who carried history on his shoulders. She poured a cup of coffee from a steaming pot and set it carefully in front of him. The dark surface of the drink caught the lantern light as a thin curl of steam rose into the warm air. "Coffee travels better than whiskey when a man has miles behind him," she said with a knowing smile. Sam nodded politely and wrapped his hands around the warm cup, feeling the heat settle into his fingers. It had been a long time since anyone had greeted him with that kind of quiet kindness. Around the room, the townspeople of Redstone Hollow had begun returning to their conversations, though every few moments someone would glance toward the bar where the quiet rider now stood. The young man at the piano continued playing a gentle tune that seemed to match the steady rhythm of the evening. Sheriff Daniel Burke stepped inside a moment later and leaned against the far end of the bar, tipping his hat respectfully toward Miss Clara before looking back at Sam. "Looks like the town has decided to behave itself tonight," the sheriff said with a relaxed grin. Sam took a slow sip of the coffee and nodded once. "Seems like a good town," he replied calmly. Wade Mercer entered just behind the sheriff, brushing a little dust from his coat before removing his hat. The young rider hesitated for a second as he stepped farther into the room, clearly still deciding how to act around the man whose reputation had suddenly become real. Miss Clara noticed the tension immediately and gave Wade a small, encouraging smile. "Well, do not stand there like a fence post," she said warmly. "Find a chair and let the man drink his coffee in peace." A few quiet chuckles moved through the room as Wade nodded and took a seat at a nearby table. The moment seemed to loosen the air again, and soon the gentle rhythm of conversation returned. Sam watched the room for a while, his calm eyes moving slowly from the lanterns above to the people gathered around the tables. These small frontier towns had always fascinated him. They were places where strangers arrived with dusty boots and uncertain pasts, yet somehow found a place to sit down and share a warm drink before moving on again. Miss Clara leaned forward slightly, resting her hands on the counter. "You have the look of a man who has seen a great deal of country," she said thoughtfully. "The kind that stretches farther than most people here will ever ride." Sam gave a faint smile that barely touched his eyes. "The road has a way of showing a man more than he plans to see," he answered quietly. Miss Clara studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if confirming something she already suspected. "Well," she said gently, "sometimes the road brings a man exactly where he needs to stop for a while." Sam glanced down at the coffee in his hands, and then toward the saloon doors where the fading light of sunset still lingered beyond the glass. For the first time in many miles, The road behind him felt quiet enough that staying a little longer might not be such a bad idea. The lantern light in the Redstone Saloon burned a little brighter as night finally settled over the town, and the steady hum of conversation slowly filled the room with the comfortable sound of people who had finished their day's work. Samuel Callahan remained at the bar with his coffee, listening to the piano in the corner glide from one slow tune into another. The young pianist had grown more confident as the evening warmed, letting the melody drift through the wooden room like a quiet breeze over open prairie grass. Miss Clara moved calmly behind the counter, polishing a glass with a white cloth, while keeping a careful eye on the room the way only someone who had spent years running a saloon could do. She glanced toward Sam again, studying him with the thoughtful curiosity that had not left her since he stepped through the doors. "You ride alone often?" she asked gently. Sam lifted his eyes from the coffee and gave a small nod. "Most of the time," he answered. "The road is easier that way." Miss Clara leaned one elbow on the bar. "Maybe," she said, "but the road can also grow mighty quiet when a man has no one to share a story with." Sam considered that for a moment while the piano shifted into a softer melody. Around the room a few townspeople had gathered closer to listen, their curiosity about the quiet traveler slowly turning into admiration. Sheriff Daniel Burke had taken a seat at a nearby table, his chair angled so he could still see the bar, while speaking with a rancher about the coming cattle drive. Wade Mercer sat across the room with his companions, though he found himself glancing toward Sam every few minutes, as if still trying to understand how the afternoon had changed so quickly. Outside the saloon windows the last light of sunset had faded, leaving the town wrapped in the cool blue of evening. The lanterns inside reflected softly in the glass, turning the windows into mirrors of the warm room within. Sam finally took another slow drink of his coffee and set the cup down on the bar. "There were times," he said thoughtfully, "when the road was not quiet at all." Miss Clara paused her polishing and listened more closely. "I imagine that must be true," she replied. Sam's gaze drifted toward the piano player, then to the people sitting around the tables, sharing quiet laughter and conversation. "But places like this remind a man why the quiet is worth it," he continued. Miss Clara smiled gently at that, and poured a fresh cup of coffee without being asked. "Redstone Hollow is not a big town," she said, sliding the cup toward him, "but it has a habit of giving travelers a reason to stay a little longer than they planned." Sam wrapped his hands around the warm mug again, the rising steam carrying the rich smell of roasted beans. For the first time in many months, he felt the strange sense that the road ahead might wait patiently while he enjoyed the stillness of a friendly town. Across the room Wade Mercer stood and slowly approached the bar, his expression carrying none of the earlier pride from the dusty street outside. He placed a small silver coin on the counter beside Sam's cup and nodded respectfully. "That is for the bottles," Wade said quietly. Sam looked down at the coin for a moment, then gently pushed it back toward the young rider with a calm smile. "Consider it a lesson," he said, and the entire room grew a little quieter as everyone listening realized that the most valuable thing Samuel Callahan had brought into their town was not his reputation, but the quiet wisdom carried by a man who had ridden farther than most would ever dream. The quiet that followed Samuel Callahan's words lingered in the Redstone Saloon like the final note of the piano drifting through the room. Wade Mercer slowly picked up the silver coin that Sam had pushed back toward him, turning it once between his fingers before sliding it back into his pocket. For the first time since the afternoon, the young rider looked less like a man trying to prove something and more like someone thinking carefully about the road ahead. The lantern light above the bar flickered softly, reflecting in the polished wood while Miss Clara set another pot of coffee on the warmer behind her. The piano player eased into a slower melody now, one that carried the calm feeling of evening settling across the plains. Around the tables, the people of Redstone Hollow listened quietly, their conversations lowered as if they understood that this moment had become something worth remembering. Sheriff Daniel Burke watched the exchange from his chair, leaning back with a thoughtful expression as he studied the old rider standing at the bar. "You see that look on a man once in a while," the sheriff said to the rancher beside him. "It is the look of someone who has traveled far enough to know that pride is lighter when you leave some of it behind." The rancher nodded slowly, glancing toward Sam with quiet respect. At the bar Wade Mercer rested both hands on the counter, his voice carrying none of the sharp edge it had earlier in the day. "Mr. Callahan," he said carefully, "I have heard stories about men like you all my life. Riders who seemed larger than the towns they passed through. I always figured those stories had grown bigger than the truth." Sam lifted his coffee again and took a slow drink before answering. "Most stories do," he said calmly. Wade nodded once. "But not today," he replied quietly. Sam looked at the young rider for a moment, the faint smile returning beneath the lantern light. "Today was just a man learning something about patience," he said. Miss Clara leaned forward slightly with a warm look in her eyes. "And sometimes patience is the rarest skill a man can carry," she added. The room softened again as a few people returned to their drinks and quiet laughter, though every now and then someone would glance toward the bar where the old cowboy stood. Outside the saloon windows the night had grown deep and calm, the prairie wind whispering gently through the dark streets of Redstone Hollow. Sam glanced toward the door for a moment, thinking of the long miles of trail that waited beyond the town limits. Yet something about the warmth of the room and the steady rhythm of the piano made the road feel far away for once. Sheriff Burke finally stood and walked over to the bar, resting one elbow beside Sam's coffee cup. "You know," the sheriff said thoughtfully, "most towns only get one story worth telling every few years. Looks like ours arrived this afternoon." Sam chuckled softly under his breath, the sound quiet but genuine. "Every town already has its stories," he replied. "Sometimes it just takes the right moment for people to notice them." The lanterns flickered gently above as the people of Redstone Hollow settled deeper into the evening, and somewhere beyond the windows the quiet road stretched into the darkness, waiting patiently for whenever Samuel Callahan decided it was time to ride again. The evening in the Redstone Saloon deepened into a calm rhythm that felt older than the town itself. Lanterns swayed slightly from the ceiling beams, their warm light dancing across the wooden walls while the piano continued its slow, steady melody in the corner. Samuel Callahan sat quietly at the bar now, his hat resting beside his hand and the warmth of the coffee cup still lingering in his fingers. Around him the people of Redstone Hollow had begun to relax completely, their voices rising again in gentle conversation as the tension of the afternoon faded into something closer to admiration. Wade Mercer had returned to his table with his companions, though every few minutes he glanced toward the bar with a thoughtful look that suggested the day had left a deeper mark on him than he expected. Sheriff Daniel Burke remained nearby, leaning comfortably against the bar as he spoke with Miss Clara about the cattle shipments expected later that month. The air inside the saloon had grown pleasantly warm, carrying the mixed scent of coffee, wood polish, and the faint sweetness of fresh bread cooling somewhere in the kitchen behind the bar. For Samuel Callahan, the quiet comfort of the room felt strangely unfamiliar. He had spent so many evenings beside lonely campfires that the simple sound of a room full of friendly voices almost felt like music itself. Miss Clara noticed the distant expression in his eyes and placed another cup of coffee beside him without a word. "A traveler sometimes forgets what it feels like to sit still," she said gently. Sam nodded slowly. "The road teaches a man to keep moving," he replied, "but it does not always teach him how to stop." Miss Clara smiled at that, her silver hair catching the lantern light as she leaned against the bar. "Stopping is easier when a town knows how to welcome a stranger," she said. Sam glanced around the room once more. The ranchers at the far table were laughing over a story about a stubborn mule. The piano player had begun another soft tune, and Sheriff Burke was nodding thoughtfully while listening to a farmer describe the coming wheat harvest. It was the quiet harmony of a place that had learned how to live together on the frontier. Sam lifted his coffee and let the warmth settle into him again. "You have a good town here," he said quietly. Miss Clara followed his gaze around the room and nodded with quiet pride. "It did not start that way," she said. "Every town out here begins rough. It takes time, patience, and a few good lessons before people remember how to treat one another." Sam allowed a faint smile to appear again. "Sounds like the same lesson the road teaches," he replied. Across the room Wade Mercer stood slowly from his chair and walked toward the door, pausing briefly beside the bar. He tipped his hat toward Sam with genuine respect before stepping outside into the cool night air. Through the saloon window Sam could see the young rider pause beneath the lantern hanging above the boardwalk, looking out across the quiet street of Redstone Hollow, as if seeing it differently than he had that morning. The piano continued its calm melody behind him while the night settled fully over the prairie beyond the town. And in that quiet moment, Samuel Callahan realized that sometimes the greatest mark a man leaves on a place is not the stories told about him, but the small change he leaves behind in the people who watched him pass through. The night outside the Redstone Saloon had grown calm and wide, the kind of quiet that settles over the prairie when the wind finally decides to rest. Inside, the lanterns burned low and steady while the piano eased into its final tune of the evening, a soft melody that drifted gently through the warm wooden room. Samuel Callahan finished the last of his coffee and placed the empty cup back onto the polished bar. Miss Clara collected it with a small nod, understanding without words that the moment had arrived when a traveler begins thinking about the road again. Sheriff Daniel Burke remained leaning against the counter, watching the older cowboy with the thoughtful patience of a man who knew better than to rush the ending of a good story. Around the saloon, the townspeople of Redstone Hollow had begun drifting toward the doors and boardwalk, their voices low and easy as the evening settled into its final hours. Sam picked up his hat and rested it back on his head, the worn brim casting its familiar shadow across his calm eyes. For a moment he looked around the room once more, quietly memorizing the glow of the lanterns, the polished wood of the bar, and the peaceful sound of neighbors sharing the same roof. These were the small moments the long road rarely offered. Miss Clara folded the cloth she had been using and smiled warmly. "You are welcome here any time the trail brings you back," she said. Sam nodded once in gratitude. "I believe that," he replied softly. Sheriff Burke pushed away from the bar and walked with him toward the door. The cool night air slipped through the swinging saloon doors as they stepped onto the boardwalk, carrying the wide scent of prairie grass and distant hills under a sky filled with bright western stars. Wade Mercer stood near the hitching rail beside Sam's horse, his posture relaxed but respectful. When Sam approached, Wade tipped his hat once more. "Safe travels, Mr. Callahan," he said quietly. Sam rested a hand on the horse's neck before answering. "Take care of this town," he replied calmly. Wade nodded, understanding that the words carried more meaning than they first appeared. Sam mounted the saddle, with the smooth motion of a rider who had done so thousands of times before. The leather creaked softly as he settled into place and gathered the reins. For a moment he paused, looking down the quiet main street of Redstone Hollow where lanterns glowed in windows and the last voices of the evening drifted through the warm summer air. Sheriff Burke crossed his arms and watched with a faint smile. "You know," the sheriff said thoughtfully, "people around here will be talking about today for a long time." Sam gave a small chuckle beneath the brim of his hat. "Let them talk about the town instead," he answered. Then he nudged the horse forward gently. The hooves moved slowly at first along the dusty road before turning toward the open prairie beyond the last building. Wade Mercer and Sheriff Burke stood beneath the lantern light watching the rider disappear into the quiet darkness beyond the town. And long after the sound of hooves faded into the night, the people of Redstone Hollow would remember the evening when a quiet old cowboy passed through their street and reminded everyone that true strength does not need noise to be seen, only the calm courage to stand with dignity when the moment arrives.